You're listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we're tuning into a session from the ABA archive presented virtually at Winter Institute 2021, creating a work environment that embraces access, equity, and justice.
Okay, looks like we are. My name is Amber Cabral. Thank you for joining us for today's session. We are in the Creating Sustainable and Inclusive Organizer session. I am, again, as I stated, Amber Cabral. I'm the author of a book called Allies and Advocates, Creating an Inclusive and Equitable Culture that came out last November. So I'm a new author. And I'm also an inclusion and diversity strategist, certified coach, speaker, and a number of other things that I do, as well as chair a fantastic organization called Brown Girls Do Ballet. So today I would like to introduce to you our speakers as we jump into a conversation about recognizing harmful workplace practices and creating some necessary steps around dismantling the culture of white supremacy in the workplace. So first with us, we have Dr. Stephanie Pinder-Amaker. She is the co-author of Did That Just Happen? Beyond Diversity, Creating Sustainable and Inclusive Organizations. Dr. Pinder is the first Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at McLean Hospital and an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. She lectures and conducts workshops throughout the country on strategies for promoting mental health and emotional well-being among students of color and those who hold rising identities. She's also a national expert in college mental health and a member of the World Health Organization World Mental Health International College Student Initiative. She is the co-founder of Twin Star Intersectional Diversity Trainers. And she opened that organization to address issues of identity and inclusion in the workplace, and is also the co-author of the book we just talked about, Did That Just Happen? Beyond Diversity, Creating Sustainable and Inclusive Organizations, which will be coming out on Beacon Press. We also have with us today Dr. Lauren Wadsworth. She is the co-author, along with Stephanie, of Did That Just Happen? She is a clinical psychologist who's passionate about furthering diversity and inclusion efforts. She serves as a senior advisor on the Anti-Racist Justice and Health Equity team at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. She is the founder and director of Genesee Valley Psychology, a clinic providing evidence-based treatment to the Rochester, New York area, specializing in OCD, trauma, DBT, and the newly launched Racial Trauma and Healing Center. She is the co-founder of Twin Stars Diversity Trainers, a consulting company offering diversity and identity-related training for organizations and leadership. Finally, she is a clinical senior instructor in psychiatry at the University of Rochester Medical Center. Thank you for joining me together today, ladies. I really appreciate being here for this chat.
Thank you.
Here.
Excited to be here.
Good to see you both. So let's jump right into our questions.
Right.
The first question I have for you today is really about identity and the scarcity of identities that are represented in the book selling field. So I'm sure there are people that are in this room that are eager to make changes, interested in how we can invite more diverse identities to be a participant in the book selling world. But we know that this work can be a little bit tricky. So what are some of the common missteps that folks might engage in after they leave this presentation and they're ready to jump in and make a change?
Thank you, Amber. Thank you for the introduction. We're excited to be here and really honored to share this platform with you today. So the most common misstep that we've identified among organizations that are eager, motivated to increase their workforce diversity is what we refer to in our book as the cart before the horse. And that means getting out there, actively recruiting diverse talent before creating a workplace that holds an environment that's actually knowledgeable about how to welcome, receive, nurture, and collaborate with that diverse talent, how to do this effectively, how to do it skillfully across sociocultural identities, right? You're bringing in lots of new diversity across race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, national origin, ability, status. But are you prepared to actually welcome those individuals into the organization? It's a very common and unfortunately costly mistake that perpetuates what we refer to as the leaky pipeline, or basically staff turnover. So the cart before the horse. This is an expression, we've all used it, we've all heard it before, but I want to ask you to just close your eyes for a moment and try to get that image. Try to get the image. Picture the cart going maybe on a slight incline up the hill with the horse following behind. Because if you can hold that image in your mind, you will always remember that putting the cart before the horse is a time-honored approach that is absolutely destined to go nowhere.
Yeah, thanks for that analogy. I've heard that statement many times, cart before the horse. And you're right. I've heard lots of companies that are saying, where's the diverse talent? Where do we get these folks? And they're not at all ready to support them. I'd love to hear what else you can share with us today, Lauren.
Yeah, so I think an example of what the cart before the horse looks like is you might have a few employees of color in your organization already, or you might have just hired some queer employees, or an employee that's trans. And you might think, this might be a great person to ask what we should do about diversity here, right? I'm sure some of us have made that mistake already. So one of the big mistakes we look out for is underappreciating what it's like to be a pioneer. To be the first or the only within an organization comes with many painful, difficult, and heavy experiences. So we need to understand that that is a part of this process and might already be something that's happening within your workplace. So pioneers, the firsts and the onlys, we often experience increased microaggressions. We call them identity-related aggressions, to take the micro out. They might be called on to explain certain things about their identity, and might not have colleagues to share those painful experiences with by being the onlys within their organization. We also see that employers and organizations will look to that person and ask, hey, what diversity issues do we have here? Or how can we hire more diverse staff? Or do you have problems working here? Or can you train us on how to do better? So asking your employees to do that work for you is harmful because, one, it assumes that they want to be doing this work, or that they're an expert on this, or want to be a trainer of others. And two, if the employee does take on that torch, which might not feel like a choice since their boss is asking them to do it, they have this new role on top of their already full-time job, having to work harder than those with privilege around them. And then finally, have to deliver often really difficult feedback to their supervisors or colleagues about the ways that they're not doing things right. And that can lead to retaliation, resentment, or being disliked by your colleagues or supervisors. So we just think it's so dangerous to underappreciate what it's like to be a pioneer in the industry, and then also to put a further burden on without being thoughtful about what that might look like, or a different way of approaching that goal.
Yeah, I love that you shared that. I think a lot of people can relate to being asked to do something, and the person asking is innocently asking, often just trying to address a concern, and then ultimately not realizing the burden that comes with. All of a sudden, now I've got to give you some hard feedback. And again, you might be my boss, you might have a say in my performance appraisal, and so I don't really want to be the one to do this labor. Great call outs there. I really appreciate that. Any other ideas that you want to share with me around, just making sure that there are some of those major missteps that we stay away from?
Yes. People in leadership roles especially often fall prey to this next misstep. And that's the trap of oppressive listening, which is a term that we've coined and written about in the book. As leaders, managers, we've all heard this, supervisors, et cetera. we're often and historically rewarded, right? For thinking quickly, we can generate solutions. We're big problem solvers. We speak up in meetings. We know how to have a commanding presence in the room and so forth. However, when promoting a work environment that's actually equitable, inclusive, accessible, and just, these same sort of winning and achieving behaviors will often be experienced as oppressive or even stifling by the people within the organization who hold less authority, less privilege, less power, less seniority. So I want to demonstrate this is what an oppressive listening exchange sounds like. I'm going to ask you as you listen to see if you can recognize the oppressive listening traps. We put them in a handout that was shared as a collateral material for this panel. But some of the oppressive listening traps include, but are not limited to, denial, skipping validation, or worse, invalidating the speaker altogether, focusing on the listener instead of the speaker, and jumping prematurely to problem solving. So, all right, I'm a manager and an intern whom we've recruited as part of our pipeline efforts, say, to increase the racial and ethnic diversity, let's say, of our organization, comes in for our monthly review meeting and shares with me the following.
Stephanie, the only 2 staff members who identify as women of color have been here for several years without being promoted, whereas the white male staff are moving up the ladder quickly. And as a Latinx woman, I'm wondering what that means for my own future within this organization.
So the oppressive listener might say something like, you know, we are actually lucky to have 2 employees of color. We have more gender and racial diversity than our competitors, which is really something. And I'm actually really glad that you brought this up today because you cannot even imagine how difficult it's been for me to get our numbers where they are and to sustain them. I can't go into personal matters with you, but I'm not sure that the employees that you're referring to are actually interested in management positions per se. And you can't ever assume that your experience would be exactly the same as theirs. You're different people after all. And I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I did take the APA's cultural competency course a few years back. I did really well. So did you hear it? You heard it, right? The oppressive listening traps. You heard the denial, the defensiveness, the total invalidation, the explaining away. Things are so much better today than they were previously. Can you imagine how the intern might have felt in that exchange?
Yeah, I noticed that when I first spoke, when I was imagining being this person, I felt anxious and a little bit hopeful. But within maybe the sentence or even the one after, it's like very early on, I had a sense of, oh, this isn't going well. And I noticed a wall come up and I thought, I'm never going to talk about this again.
Yeah, I love that you shared that. So just to recap, what I heard was denial, skipping over. I also heard kind of a issue in there, like I'm not really focusing on the real thing that needs the attention. And then also jumping to, oh yeah, we can solve that. I'm so glad you mentioned it actually, right? I love that. Thanks so much for including those steps. It's really, really easy to slip into the oppressive listening traps, right? Sometimes we're just carrying the conversation.
And you picked up on all of them, Amber. So excellent.
Thanks for that. All right. So my next question, what should we do instead? Okay. So you gave us a recap of what not to do. But what are some tips or advice or some direction that you can share with us about what we should do when we leave this presentation super excited to make a change?
Well, not to beat a dead horse, but I do think it is good to come back to that cart before the horse metaphor and think about what does it look like on the flip side. So what does it mean to build a horse? And in this metaphor, we think of the horse as a complex set of these important skills of cultural humility, awareness, and responsiveness. And those skills are huge, complex, difficult skills that require thousands of muscles that need to be made and strengthened over time. So much like going to the gym, building our own horse as an organization is a lifetime commitment. It's not just something that you do in 10 workouts and you sweat like hell, but then you're done. You can't just get a horse and then not train it, right? It needs to be fed and trained in a consistent, ongoing manner. So what that might look like is, I think I'm just going to put it right out there first and foremost, the organization is probably going to have to pay to invest in long-term training. Again, not going inwards and asking people that are the most vulnerable in some cases within your organization to do the work and take the risk, but instead to put your money where your mouth is. If you really want to change this, then you should hire an external consultant and commit to creating a relationship with one or multiple that can give you feedback and guidance as you engage in a years-long, decades-long process. That can start with leadership. For example, training leadership on oppressive listening and empowering listening skills. Really important to check within your organization if the whole leadership team is actually committed to this and does understand what the problems are and is ready to engage in the hard work. Because if they're not, then imagine what it would be like to go home or to get back into your next Zoom with your employees after this conference and say, all right, we're going to do this. And then employees start talking to some members of leadership and then are met with oppressive listening, right? Leadership needs to be ready to do this right. And then after that, training employees, training the whole staff together to develop shared language. And by that, we mean understanding what identity-related aggressions are, but we also mean talking about race, sexual orientation, and gender in a way that we maybe never have before. And that practice is extremely hard and beautiful and amazing work. And it takes a lot of practice and leadership and coaching. So investing in that as a company is key. And again, this isn't something that is a one and done. It's not something that you can even see your statistics changing, like building a Twitter following. It's something that will feel uncertain and scary and is hard work that you have to recommit to each day.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I do think, my day job is an inclusion and diversity strategist. And so I say the most often is your racism tomorrow. Like, just let's be very purposeful and deliberate about kind of creating the right environment. And that's what I hear you saying is like, we have to recognize that, like, let's get the groundwork in. Let's also understand that this is a long haul game. We're not going to do it in one training. We're not going to do it in one conversation. We've got to work on it and build the muscle to be able to sustain the type of environment that we are looking to create. So I love what you shared around that. What other advice do you have to share, Stephanie?
This next bit of advice, this next step that we're going to recommend is one that is often bypassed. I think there's a strong tendency to want to skip this particular step because it can be difficult for organizations to do this. It can be painful, but I think it's absolutely necessary. And that is to know your history, acknowledge the legacy of injustice in your company, within your industry, because without that basic knowledge, you are not well positioned to create real sustainable change, right? Because history is destined to repeat itself. Things are as they are for a reason. There are structures holding up the inequities and the injustices that we're trying to change. And relatedly, as you're perhaps learning more, striving more to hear more and learning more about your own organization, your own company's history, and the employees' experiences of, say, bias or marginalization, we recommend that you begin to hone your empowering listening skills. I want to return to the earlier example and just give you an example of what an empowering listening response would have been to the young intern who presented her concerns earlier. because an empowering listening response will do both of the things that I just mentioned, right? It's going to name the historical injustice and also empower the listener. And it might sound something like this. So, Lauren, thank you for sharing your observation. I can actually see how we're sending mixed messages about our company's values and priorities. And I think your point is, it's difficult to hear, but I think it's a valid one. I imagine it would be discouraging not to see women and people of color, or people who look like you, reflected in our organization, particularly among our leadership. You know, I think we both know that racial and gender inequities in our industry are longstanding, and we need to do better. There are no two ways about it. I want you to know that I'm committed to addressing this with the board and with leadership of our organization so that our workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion actually begins to align with our values.
I noticed that when you were talking, I felt encouraged. And I even noticed that your stance of talking was much more open and inviting and smiling. I wanted to look at you more than the first time. And I noticed that your response included thanking me, naming the injustice directly, which I think is often so missed, just like calling it out as it is, validating me, modeling that you find my report credible, that you believe me, confirming it's not okay, committing to do better, and also at the very end, sharing one action that you would take to change things or try to change things going forward, which I think was talking to the board. So taking that onus and noticing that you didn't ask me what you should do or tell me that I wasn't understanding the situation right.
Yeah, I would just tack on to that. Thank you. That was so, I could actually feel, I think, what you were feeling when you were describing the really contrast in how it felt to be heard in that way. But we would encourage companies to consider building these empowering listening skills as teams. This is really fun to do and empowering. It works very well. It's sort of reinforcing and sort of builds in an organic way to actually see the oppressive listening behaviors decline in staff meetings, in boardrooms, in performance reviews, and really shift toward empowering listening behaviors and reinforce noticing it in each other, saying, yeah, I saw Amber did that. And that reminds me that I talk way too much in meetings and really need to sit back and make room and space for others to be heard at the table.
Yeah, I love that. I think giving people kind of the tips, which you have when you get your sheet for this session, is really helpful. It gives people a little bit of a framework to kind of keep in mind. What I recommend a lot of times after folks leave training, someone in my organization is like, and pay attention for the behaviors there, because it's unnerving to do it in your workplace right away. But just pay attention to the media or listen to whatever your normal podcasts are, and you'll be surprised at how good you can get at identifying either the empowering listening or the oppressive listening in just other folks, so that you can start to see what that should come to life like in your own space. I love those recommendations. Thank you so much. Do you have any other advice that you want to share before I hop over to the next question?
Yeah. I just want to say I love that suggestion that you just made, because it's so much less threatening. And we talk about this a lot. And then in our work with companies too, it can be less threatening to sort of observe it first in the third person, right? You're not having to start with the painful introspective work, but, watching TV, listening to podcasts, that's really nice. We're going to remember that. So, I would say this is really amazing. A pivotal awakening or light bulb moment that we often observe, which is really cool to see when companies do this. We call it in psychology an aha moment. It's when organizations actually free themselves up to admit what they don't know. It can be just so very liberating to say something like, we really just don't have the expertise internally to do this on our own. You know, and if you think about it, if you say needed to design a high-tech, sophisticated, interactive 500-page website that could increase your online book sales, let's say by 150%, you go right out and hire for that expertise. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is also a specific realm of expertise and mastery that will influence your organization's bottom line. So we just want to, can't say it often enough, prioritize the work, value the work, budget for the work, resource it properly, integrate it into your strategic plan. And we want to just, encourage folks to access the phenomenal, incredible expertise that's available, that's missing from your company. Bring it into your company. And remember that expertise may come in the form of consultants like Amber or us, or trainings, or courses, podcasts, online materials, but also in the form of books like Amber Cabral's Allies and Advocates, or our book, Did That Just Happen?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for that. That was such a great and thorough response. Don't forget, there is a document to support this, because you get an opportunity to go back and review, which I love, because you've given so many amazing tips already so far. So my next question is, what if I'm just afraid to say anything? Maybe I'm afraid I'm going to mess up. Maybe I've messed up in the past pretty badly. What would you say to people who are having that moment where they're just afraid to step out and say anything?
Well, first I would validate that, right? Like following our skills we just talked about, validate that that's something that we all feel, right? I know that myself, Stephanie, I'm guessing Amber, unless you're an alien, everyone watching this, Brian, who's signing it, has anxiety doing new things, especially when it comes to something that we've been literally socialized not to do. We've been socialized not to talk about race, not to talk about gender identity or sexual orientation, especially across difference, right? Stephanie and I engaging in this work together, talking about race with me as a white person, is something we were not taught to do in kindergarten or in college, and actively we're taught not to do.
Or even in grad school, for that matter.
Even in grad school. Well, maybe
yeah.
So Stephanie and I like to say that messing up is something that shouldn't be feared, but expected. That engaging in this work means doing something new and different that you were taught not to do. And that's going to mean a process of learning the ways that you were socialized to step on people, talk over people, belittle people, if you hold privilege in an identity, noticing yourself doing that, and then hearing about the ways you're doing that from other people, and then committing to change. So in an essence, this work is about messing up. It is about charting new territory bravely, knowing that you're going to make mistakes. So if you're waiting to start this until you feel ready or capable, you're never going to start. It's a vulnerable process. And when we do mess up, it's extremely uncomfortable, right? We feel defensive. We might want to clarify what we meant, or try to, explain the situation away. But it's really, really important in those mistake moments to be thankful that someone is trusting you enough to give you that feedback. So in addition to all that, I would just say, don't embark on, and this is like coming from a white person to any white people in the room, especially, don't start this work expecting to get the same level of congratulations and awards and accolades that you might be used to getting when you master skills. In a lot of ways, for me, this work has been in an echo chamber of silence in the beginning. And then as I continued getting negative feedback, so it's like very opposite of a lot of skill building. So don't take a lack of congratulations as a sign that you're not doing, trying the right things or on the right path. But it's just different in a lot of ways, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you so much for that. I do think that the acknowledgement is a big deal, that you're going to be uncomfortable. It's going to happen. You're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. I think we are also kind of to your point of socializing.
Yeah.
This idea that oh, I can practice and get it right. And this is a thing that we're talking about identity. It's not always going to be right. So I want to make sure I give you an opportunity to chime in as well, Stephanie, but I want to also give a nudge to our listeners. I know you have a chat box. We've only seen a couple questions trickle in. I would love for you to please find your chat box and type some questions in there, because we are going to be pulling some of those once we get one more question out of the way first. And I want to give us a second to transition our interpreter. All right, perfect. Okay, great. So, Stephanie, do you have anything to add around what you should, expect if you're scared to mess up? Like, what are the tips to kind of move away from it?
Yes, surprisingly, I do have something to add. And this is going to sound so basic, so straightforward, but we are really unskilled at doing this. And that is when you've messed up, which you will, as both Lauren and Amber have said, know how to apologize sincerely, apologize quickly, and know how to apologize without further burdening the person or the people who you have offended or injured. And so here again, the oppressive versus empowering listening skills, I think, can be applied to the skill of apologizing. And it is a skill. You have to practice to know what an authentic, you know it when you hear it, right? What an authentic apology sounds like. But just as with listening, the behaviors or impulses that you suppress are just, or maybe just as important as the ones you develop. So when making an empowering apology, you want to acknowledge your misstep, right? Own it. You want to commit to change and then follow through with that commitment, obviously, and then ask permission to follow up. So sometimes we say follow through and follow up, but it's important to ask permission. If it's okay with you, I would like to tell you what steps I take in the future. You don't want to go on and on and on about how terrible you feel and you couldn't sleep last night and you're sick to your stomach and you just feel so guilty and embarrassed and ashamed. All of that type of behavior, that is an oppressive apology. And what it does, just as with listening, is it shiftly, sometimes sort of sneakily, shifts the focus away from shifts the focus to the apologer, the one who's attempting to apologize, and away from the person who's been harmed or injured. And further, it puts the person who's on the receiving end, and you probably have been on the receiving end of that type of apology, right? It's the apology that feels like it is just not going to end. You just want to put the person out of their misery. But unfortunately, this is really important to know that that type of apology then puts that person in a very awkward and sometimes painful position of reassuring you, forgiving you, taking care of you, your needs, your feelings. It's oppressive. Don't do it.
I love what you shared about apologies. I talk about apologies a lot. I actually make a point to include apologies in every single presentation I get because we do it badly.
We do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You can pop out, on social media, you can, watch whatever news channel and you will guaranteed within a week see a really, really bad apology. And so the recommendation that I make in Allies and Advocates is a little formula that you can put in your pocket that helps you keep yourself out of those non-apologies. And so what I usually recommend people do is say, I apologize for, moving forward, I will. I apologize for mispronouncing your name, Stephanie. Moving forward, I'll make sure to say it correctly. If you use that, what you're doing is you're apologizing for what you broke. And then you're telling folks how you're going to fix it going forward. I love the additional perspective of adding in, can I circle back? You know how it's going. Can we have some additional conversation? Because that lets the person that you're apologizing to know, oh, this person is actually interested in doing better, right? And so I do think that apologies are a really, really critical part of actually saying, okay, I'm a little nervous, but now at least you know when you mess up, right? When you mess up, you know how to apologize and move forward past that. Now, I have a little bit of a question I'm going to sneak in here, but I think both of these are well prepared to be able to talk about this. What do you do if, someone shares with you that you messed up and you didn't realize you messed up? Like maybe you kind of get busted a little bit in your privilege. What are your thoughts around that experience?
I'd say that, it's the same type of empowering apology is required. The rules don't change. Often, when we mess up, we're not messing up intentionally, right? It's going to often be someone calling us in or maybe calling us out on our privilege or something that we weren't aware of. And so for me, the same sort of formula, and I love that formula, applies. And also, and the commitment might sound like something like, I wasn't aware of that. Thank you for pointing it out to me. I'm going to learn more about that and do better.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to some of the questions that have come in from the audience. One that jumped out at me was about how you can, I'm trying to scroll back up and find it there. Okay. All right. So does anyone have any thoughts about building buy-in for this process at the leadership level? How do I get my leaders to see we need to make this investment and commit?
I have some thoughts on that. The two things come to mind immediately. The first thing that comes to mind is first, knowing the statistics, knowing that teams that are more diverse across all identities, gender, sexual orientation, ability, status, race, ethnicity, are better teams. They're more effective, and they're more creative and just better all around for your bottom line. That's important to know. Two, it's important to know that it's really hard to do that and to sustain a diverse workforce, given the skills that we were raised with in society. And so three, it's really important to do training and work to be able to achieve that ideal workspace. Secondly, I would say, my number system's a little messed up. I would also just say a skill I've really found useful is to kind of join with leadership on their ego and values. So I've tried things when I was an underling in a workplace, trying to do this very same thing by saying, wow, I noticed that in all of these ways, in research, in evidence-based treatments, you are ahead of the field. You are ahead of the wave. You have always strived to be excellent, to be number one. And I believe that's something that you value, doing the right thing and the best thing. And this is a piece of that. To not do that is to not be number one. And to miss that is to risk losing that status. I think you want to be ahead of the wave. I know how to do that in this realm. And I think it's worth committing if you still want to be ahead of most other people. So kind of joining with leadership values.
Yeah, I love that. Connecting it to leadership values has always been a win for me. I always push that, recommendation, because if you say you value this, how's that come to life as it relates to us actually having folks that can do it, right? Because the people are where the diversity and the inclusion happen. So great examples there, Lauren. Thank you so much. So can
I just say one
please.
thing? I just want to thank just really grateful for that question, because it points out something that's really important not to sort of gloss over, which is, the research tells us overwhelmingly that having leadership buy-in is so critical. So great question.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so this one's a really good question. I think that can probably be one folks can relate to. So this person asks, my store is full of many different types of identities. How do I help people who are of different identities, some being diverse, also understand that their behavior could be more inclusive? So I'm a diverse person too, but I can be more inclusive.
Yeah, we love to use the addressing framework by Dr. Pamela Hayes. which I'm sure you're familiar with, Amber, but I'll just review it briefly for the listeners. The addressing framework is the world's longest acronym, in my opinion, addressing, and it stands for all the different sociocultural identities we hold: age, diagnoses, disability status, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, race, indigenous status, nation of origin, gender identity, and expression. And I missed one.
Religion?
Status.
Yeah.
And our trainings always start with an exploration of how every employee identifies across that whole spectrum, and then an exploration of where do you hold privilege and where do you hold an identity that's been associated with more barriers. To understand ourselves more complexly helps us understand that we all have a role in creating more sustainable workforces, and gives us a space to communicate across identities and about how we've been hurt or how things aren't going well, and remembering that we can all speak from our position and be right if we're holding a marginalized identity, right? So it kind of offers us a space to talk in a more nuanced way through identities.
Yeah. Love that. Thank you so much. Yes, addressing. It is a long acronym, but it is useful. It's really useful. Once you kind of have it, it is a great reference point for me as well. So here's another. Oh, well, Stephanie, did you want to chime in on that one before I shift it?
No, I was just saying we really need a visual for that addressing acronym, but you did a great job, Lauren.
Yes, absolutely.
I just, the self-exploration piece, though, it's a way that if you use that whole sort of framework, it just reminds everyone that each one of us brings to the workforce a whole rich, unique constellation of social cultural identities, right? Like we all have that. And so I like the model for that reason. And also because it gives us common language that we can use. And language is so important for being able to communicate effectively across differences. So.
Great. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
Okay. This one I think is a pretty common question I hear quite a bit as well. So I'm going to go through this next one. We are a Black, Indigenous, and people of color owned and majority operated bookstore, but my customer base is increasingly white. We are trying to figure out how to provide customer service and also protect our booksellers against rude, racist, or insensitive customers. We need perhaps maybe help managing our boundaries and our anti-racist business, as well as fulfilling our customers' expectations. Do you have any advice about how to communicate boundaries when in retail?
You get this question all the time. Go for it, Amber.
I do.
We're all about boundaries in psychology, but you go for it.
Yeah, so probably because most of my clients are retailers. So I didn't say this in my introduction. I used to work at Walmart, and so I tend to have a lot of retailer clients. And so if you are having a difficult time with customers, the thing you want to do is develop some strategies with your internal team. And by develop some strategies, I mean, think about the ways that you can show up and support. So when someone comes in and they are behaving in a way and you are having a staff member that's engaging with that, go stand next to them. Just can create a sense of, okay, I'm not in this thing by myself, right? So think about some of the tactics that you can use to like another, oh, I have a concern. If you don't have tactics for de-escalation, look into that. Getting some de-escalation techniques that all of your staff are trained on can also be really useful. And de-escalation doesn't just mean the folks that are coming in screaming and mad. It's also the people that are doing the things that you're describing, where people are rude or they're racist or they're insensitive. And it's those little behaviors that they're doing it with instead of something that's very direct and loud. So those are the two best tips I can give. Figure out how you can support one another and do it in a way that feels very visible. And then also figure out what you can do to help de-escalate so that people are prepared when someone comes in with some of those behaviors that you're describing. All right. I didn't know that question.
I mean, a lot of what you're describing also, it so resonates with, it's a huge problem in the industry in medicine and in hospitals, where people are trying to figure out how to hold the boundaries between, say, patients who are essentially customers who might be expressing racist ideas or thoughts or And so we're doing a lot of training around bystander behaviors and what it means to be an upstander. I was just thinking, Lauren, this kind of makes me think about what we write about in the book as learning how to practice moving through the freeze, because it is so natural to freeze up in those moments, to feel a sense of paralysis. So I love the examples that you gave, Amber, because it's something that you can also physically do, even when you're not sure exactly what to say initially.
Yeah, and practice it. Practice it.
Yeah.
I love that you all had some role modeling in this conversation, which is great. And so even, in your store, in your retail environment, definitely take a moment to practice it and talk about role playing it, so you can actually, when that moment happens and your brain goes, supposed to do, you'll go, wait, we rehearsed this, and you'll have a tactic in your pocket. There's so much value in just having technique, right? Remembering some of the little acronyms. I know we've thrown a lot at you in this conversation, but hopefully there's something that's like, oh my gosh, I can use that and tuck it into the way that you're running your business. Okay, my next question that comes from our audience is, do you have recommendations for how to think? Oh, wait, I'm going to change up. I read that one that was similar to that. Okay. Oh, here's the good one. You all talked about how to do the training and how to bring folks along and how it should kind of show up in the organization, particularly partnering with leadership. This follow-up question is for that. So it asks, are you recommending that a store's or management with, or do you see it as more layered?
That's a great question. And I think it really depends on the organization. I don't think that there's a one size fits all. And any person who comes in from the outside, one of the first things that they're going to do, meaning any person, not any person who comes in, a consultant with expertise in this area who comes in to work with your organization, is going to sit with you to learn about the existing culture. And from that information, they'll determine what recommendations to be. Is it going to be best in your organization for leadership to do this initially together? But there are so many individual differences and variables to consider. We worked recently with an organization where we had senior leadership, all the VPs of, this was an academic medical center, go through the empowering listening versus oppressive listening training in preparation for an anti-racist justice health equity listening tour that the hospital was about to embark upon. One of the things that we found, and the research bears this out as well, is that however you decide to come together, think about those sort of learning cohorts as resources. There can be tremendous bonding that occurs during those cohorts. And we know from the research that leaders of organizations in particular, will often say that they made some of their most memorable relationships, closest bonds and so forth through training and learning together in those types of cohorts.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add quickly that I do think at some point the whole organization does need to be offered to be a chance to be trained or get on the same page, even
Absolutely.
if it's not right away. I think eventually leadership needs to be able to have enough skills to engage in this work humbly with their lowest paid employee, and that needs to be a respectful discussion and skill built over time.
Love those shares. Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. Those shared experiences build some really meaty, meaningful connections. So I love that perspective. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay. So this person shares, I'm a new bookstore cafe owner, and I've hired a diverse staff. I am a cis straight white woman of privilege, and I'm worried that I'm being insensitive, but no one's calling me on it because I'm the boss. I'd love to hear some proactive things I can do, and potentially even some red flags I could look out for.
That's a great question. I'm sure that's accurate, that people aren't comfortable giving you the full, accurate feedback. I think there are a number of ways that this feedback can be garnered. So one is going to be in showing that you are committed to additional training and learning, that you are aiming to make yourself safer over time. It might be modeling you responding to situations like a racist employee in an effective way for staff to start feeling more comfortable around you. So not expecting it to be an expectation, but a trust that's earned over time.
That what comes to mind, I think we talk about, I love this quote. We both love this quote by Kenneth Harding, talks about the concept of being the broker of permission. And so to that, the person who offered that share, and thank you for that, remember that you have certain power and privileges, and it may be up to you to give permission to open up these dialogues, to use some of the words that people often feel reluctant to use. That's a power and a privilege that you do. You're inviting the conversation by modeling that it's okay in this organization to talk about differences or to talk about race. You're giving permission to use the words that some people really struggle with. And if they can see you modeling that, along with some of the behaviors and suggestions that Lauren made, then eventually the culture will shift and respond accordingly.
Mm-hmm. I love those shares. Thank you so much for that. Okay, we're good. We've got about 10 more minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze in at least one more question here. So this one is asking, hiring and interacting with people with visible and invisible disabilities. She's just kind of asking for a bit discussion around the topic. Do you have any specifics that might be some useful ads to share?
Yeah. Do you want to go back, Lauren, to the addressing framework? Because one of the things, there's a lot that you can do with that framework. But one of the things that you do for each aspect of identity, as Lauren mentioned earlier, in order, and I will also say we focus a lot on this in mental health. We got permission from Pamela Hayes to change the D in the addressing acronym to be inclusive of the disability of a psychiatric mental health issue or psychiatric diagnosis. And that can often be a prime example of an invisible disability. But if you go through what the model also invites us to do is, in addition to looking at each category of social cultural identity and, what is, say, regarding age in this country, the dominant aspect of identity is adult status, right? If you're adult status, you hold privilege in that age. And by default, if you're a senior citizen or a child, you're in an potentially marginalized or in dominant status. But another question that it asks is this aspect of identity visible or invisible? And it's a really important, helpful construct because people will be able to begin always to kind of think about the invisible aspects of identity that they hold. That sort of self-exploration positions each member of your organization. You have to understand who you are relative to your own complex social cultural identities. But if you gain a better understanding there, you'll be much more effective in looking for and understanding that, oh yeah, I have dyslexia, and I could very well be in the midst of coworkers who have, bipolar disorder or other kinds of invisible disabilities. Raising awareness and sensitivity is foundational.
Yeah, and I would also add thinking about ways that you can model that you're aware that some identities are invisible. So for example, interviewing a new person, say there's an option between stairs and elevator, asking the person what their preference is, not assuming that a person is able to easily access stairs just because they're walking towards you. Not assuming that every staff member is going to learn in the same way, asking people, how do you prefer to learn? Do you prefer written instructions, modeling over a number of times, modeling once, trying it independently? Just modeling that you understand that there are different ways of learning and interacting and navigating the world, and trying to ask those questions to then ideally open up and create a safe space where someone can share, hey, this is an invisible disability that I hold, and this is how I need the workplace to shift for me to be able to access it.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for those perspectives. So I'm going to squeeze in one more teeny question before I ask you to tell us about book. So this last question is really relevant to the world we're living in right now. And this person asks, how do we translate these techniques into situations that may arise virtually? Do you have any specific ideas or recommendations, since we are kind of being virtual and interacting on social media, at least for the foreseeable future?
Well, the immediate thing that comes to mind that I think we're really underutilizing, thank you for the question, first of all, but I think that we're really underutilizing in the virtual space is making sure as you're accessing all of this emerging and evolving virtual technology, be sure to automatically include different options of delivery. And don't wait to be asked, like voluntarily do those things proactively. And this technology is changing even as we're sitting here. I'm sure this platform has developed some new sort of technology. But it's, again, about not making assumptions up front and thinking about difference and accessibility. And whatever those tools are, make sure that you commit to them.
I also find that our team has been able to use Zoom to give feedback to each other in a faster way. So often we recommend, if someone uses the wrong pronouns or misspeaks or missteps, then we just correct them quickly. Oh, they use she, hers, and we move on with the conversation. But that can be so hard to do. So in our staff meetings and case consults, we have a rule where we don't use the Zoom chat unless someone is misstepped. Then we just do a message to everyone. Oh, it uses ASL, not speaks ASL. And then the person reads it. Oh, thank you for the feedback. And we move on. It's a really cool, nice way that we can actually get that feedback live and everyone can see it and model that it's okay. So just a little sneaky tip there.
Yeah, I love that. One of the recommendations I also make to clients that have this similar type of question is, to your point, Stephanie, about thinking about different abilities and needs, particularly in a virtual space. People who are deaf or hard of hearing, they read lips. So put your cameras on when you can. Get your face right up in that camera because they can still read your lips when you're on visual. And we forget that. I actually had an experience where one of my clients, I was working with a leadership team, and this gentleman kind of chimed up no one knew that I was hard of hearing. I didn't have to tell anyone this. Yeah. But now that we're virtual and people don't always have their video up, I felt like, oh my gosh, I have to reveal this thing about myself. And I'm incredibly embarrassed. I didn't want to tell anyone, but I need to have people try to, put themselves in a position where I can go back to using the skills I have, because this isn't a person that uses ASL. This is someone that actually reads lips because they kind of developed the hearing deficiency over time. And so thinking about those accessibility things are really key. But I think also the other thing is a lot of the tips that we've shared in this conversation are actually useful, even virtual, like how to apologize and making sure that you're being thoughtful about, the way you are having conversations. Those are techniques and tools, including those that you're going to get on your worksheet. So make sure you go get that you'll be able to still use, even if you're in a real life environment, on the phone. All of those things can still be applied in the various mediums that we use to communicate. So in this last few minutes, I want to give you ladies both an opportunity to please tell us about your upcoming book. When can we get it? When's it coming out? Tell us about it.
So do you want me to start, Lauren?
Yep.
I can't see you right now on the screen. Something happened. But I can feel you're there. And so the title of the book is Did That Just Happen? Beyond Diversity, Creating Sustainable and Inclusive Organizations. And it's all about exactly what we've written about today. I mean, we're both psychologists and we're researchers. We use a lot of evidence-based approaches and apply what we know from the field of psychology. But what we left out was the jargon and, the difficult to understand terminology. The purpose of writing the book was to be able to empower people, to give them basic skills for doing what we talked about doing here today, building organizations that are not only increasingly diverse, but are sustainably so, that really practice core principles of inclusivity. The book was written to be practical, accessible, hands-on. We begin each chapter with a vignette based on a real true story that has happened, something that's been reported or shared with us. In some cases, it's our own experiences in the different industries in which we've worked. And then we structure to talk about exactly why was that a problem, what to do about it. Very, very practical, hands-on. We wanted to give people something that they could pick up and implement easily.
Yep, and it's available for pre-order now, and it comes out in June, at the end of June, in paper.
All right. Thank you, ladies, so much for this fantastic conversation and allowing me to moderate the discussion. I also learned some fantastic tips that I'm going to take back and use with myself and my team and those that we support. I really appreciate also all of the attendees and dropping your great questions in the chat. I hope you got something useful. I can't wait to hear the feedback out on the interwebs about both of our books. So hopefully you'll run out and get those, and have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amber.
All righty, bye.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading! You're listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. In this episode, we're tuning into a session from the ABA archive, Creating a Work Environment that Embraces Access, Equity, and Justice, which was presented virtually at Winter Institute 2021.